Hello, everybody, and good morning, and welcome to the third day of the Portsmouth Institute, uh, 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 brought to you today by our sponsor, Wyoming Catholic College. The whole day today is based on, or is sorry, is sponsored by Wyoming Catholic College. We will get into our first session in just a minute, but I want to give you a quick rundown of the format. Our speaker will deliver remarks for about 25 minutes. I will then pop back on the screen. We'll have a conversation. While I'm doing that, you will be able to submit questions into the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and then I will be able to pose those to Dr. Glenn Arbery in just a minute. So please listen attentively and generate your questions and put those into the Q&A, and I'll make sure that we get those on. All right, so today I have for you my distinct pleasure and honor for this conference, as I have loved you, the summer conference. I have Dr. Glenn Arbery, who will deliver a talk called "Enemies and Christian Love in Shakespeare." Dr. Glenn Arbery, have his bio here, but just full disclosure, Dr. Glenn was my professor in college, and so we go way back, almost 30 years, which is a sort of a shocking number to hear me say out loud. But anyway, Dr. Glenn Arbery was born in South Carolina and reared in Georgia. He grew up as a Southerner and a Protestant. His reading of Flannery O'Connor in his freshman year at the University of Georgia began his journey toward the Roman Catholic Church. A convert at 25, he entered the church at the University of Dallas, where he met his wife-to-be, Virginia Lombardo, and later took his PhD in literature and politics with a dissertation on Shakespeare's comedies. He has taught literature at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in Merrimack, New Hampshire, the University of Dallas through the Dallas Institute, and Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he held the Dalzon Chair of Liberal Education. In 2013, he and his wife, Virginia, also a PhD from the University of Dallas, went to Wyoming Catholic College to teach humanities, trivium, and philosophy. Dr. Arbery became president of Wyoming Catholic College in 2016. He has served as director of the Teachers Academy at the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture and as an editor at People's Newspaper in Dallas, where he won regional and national awards for his writing. In addition to numerous essays and reviews, he has published 2 volumes with ISI Books, Why Literature Matters, and The Southern Critics. He is also the editor of The Tragic Abyss for the Dallas Institute Press and Augustine's Confessions and Its Influence, St. Augustine Press. His novel, Bearings and Distances, was published by Wiseblood Books in 2015, and his second, Boundaries of Eden, was published in 2020. He and his wife, Virginia, have 8 children and 22 grandchildren, and it is my distinct pleasure to turn it over to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Kale. What a pleasure to be here, especially to see one of my old students in this particular role. I remember you making jambalaya in our house back in Nashville, Kale. My talk this morning is going to be on enemies and Christian love and in Shakespeare. Christ's instructions in the Sermon on the Mount couldn't be any clearer. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. In the history of Christianity, everyone has felt the commandment to love our enemies to be the most difficult of all, indeed, to be impossible without grace. Strife with enemies is everywhere in the great pre-Christian epics. In the Iliad, the Trojans and the Achaeans are general enemies, a people against a people. In fact, so many cities in the ancient world kind of presume the presence of enemies. That's why you have walled cities and why citizens train up from their childhood and martial things. But an enemy in the true sense also has to be felt personally. For example, when Agamemnon mortally insults Achilles, he makes himself the personal enemy of this greatest warrior, who calls upon the power of Zeus to glorify Hector and help the Trojans win. The action of the poem centers on Achilles' wrath, first against the insulting Agamemnon, and only later, after the death of Patroclus, against Hector and the whole of Troy, now fueled by this intense personal enmity. We might be taken aback by the indiscriminate slaughter that comes to a focus with the death of Hector. But if we admit it, something in us is stirred by the spectacle of vengeance. In the Aeneid, for example, Aeneas exacts a just revenge for his young ally Pallas when his enemy Turnus pleads for his life. But then Aeneas sees him wearing the boy's war belt as his trophy. If you remember those last lines of the Aeneid, Aeneas stabs Turnus, and you see the soul of Turnus flee down indignantly to the underworld. So would it really be better to spare him? What about in the Christian world? Nobody who watches Hamlet wants Hamlet to ratify gross injustice by loving his usurping and murderous uncle Claudius. God help us, but it's satisfying to see him stab Claudius with the poisoned foil and force him to drink the poisoned cup. And when Macduff brings in the head of Macbeth, no one mourns for the tyrant who had ordered the deaths of Macduff's wife and children. But my meditation this morning centers on the way that Shakespeare deals with Christian love, which overcomes this rage for justice, 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 justice that Isabella demands in Measure for Measure. What does love of enemies look like? Is it the same as clemency, for example? In the classical world, Julius Caesar was notable for his clemency toward his enemies. Brutus and Cassius, among others, took the side of Pompey in the civil wars. And after defeating Pompey, Caesar might easily have had them killed. But instead, he extended his clemency and even offered them honors and offices. It looked gracious, generous, almost to a fault. But Cicero called it insidiosa clementia, treacherous clemency. In other words, in his interpretation at least, Caesar's greater power showed itself in refusing to treat these men as enemies, as though he did not think them capable of harming him. As you know, Brutus and Cassius later organized the plot against Caesar, and it would be ironic that he spared them, except that they did not so much assassinate him as immortalize him, while they themselves were forever tarred by this treachery against a benefactor. You might remember that Dante has Brutus and Cassius on either side of Judas in the 3 mouths of Satan and the depths of the Inferno. So what's the difference between Caesar's kind of clemency and the action of Christian love? When we see natural enmity and desire for revenge overcome, loving one's enemies must mean a suspension of justice in some way, at least as it affects us in our deepest selfhood. In Shakespeare's tragedies, it's rare for anyone to forgive his true enemy. Coriolanus does not forgive Rome when he gives up his attack on the city for love of his wife and mother. King Lear doesn't forgive the daughters who betray him. In fact, when Regan asked him to reconcile himself with Goneril after her mistreatment of him, Lear says, "Ask her forgiveness? Do you but mark how this becomes the house? Dear daughter, I confess that I am old," kneeling. "Age is unnecessary. On my knees, I beg that you'll vouchsafe me raiment, bed, and food." And then backing off, Lear says, "All the stored vengeances of heaven fall on her ingrateful top. Strike her young bones, you taking airs with lameness." Lear cannot forgive Goneril from this position of his felt weakness. Dramatically speaking, power is necessary to make pardon convincing. To forgive someone stronger than oneself might simply be a weak concession, the result of cowardice or a reprehensible lack of self-regard, a smallness of soul. There are nuances here, of course, since the persecutor has the power to do wrongs. For example, Leontes in The Winter's Tale, in his rage against his innocent wife, Hermione, he, with no basis, suspects her of adultery with his best friend. But after sufficient time, Hermione nevertheless forgives him from a position of moral superiority. She pardons him from her strength, not from her weakness. And maybe we can come back to this point in the discussion. But my point is that for Shakespeare, for real forgiveness to appear as it truly is, the character granting pardon needs a great heart and a sense of right that goes beyond mere retribution. In literature's imitation of life, a great deal of action is necessary before pardon or forgiveness have any emotional effect. What would the reconciliation scene between Priam and Achilles mean at the end of the Iliad, for example, if the great Achaean warrior had not already exhibited an almost illimitable capacity for murderous rage, and if Priam had not shown superb self-sacrificial courage simply in coming to the Greek camp to ask for the body of Hector, whom Achilles hates beyond all other men. That moment when the two of them have a meal together and exchange glances is a wonderful moment of peace, almost as though Homer is giving us a glimpse of Christian love, but it's visible because of the character that we know about these two great-hearted men. We also see this fully in King Lear. Cordelia, publicly humiliated, stripped of her dowry, and banished from Lear's sight, must take a long and roundabout way to remedy things. She must marry the King of France and come back to England with a French army before she can care for the ailing father who so unjustly mistreated her. Lear himself must undergo catastrophic abuse and abandonment that paradoxically reveals his greatness. When he wakes from his madness and sees Cordelia, he's completely within her power. She could exact vengeance if she so chose. Neither of her sisters would hesitate for a moment to do so. But Cordelia's is a power of care. Looking at her, uncertain of where he is or how he came to be there, Lear says, "Do not laugh at me, for as I am a man, I think this lady to be my child, Cordelia. Cordelia, and so I am. Lear, be your tears wet? Yes, Faith, I pray, weep not. If you have poison for me, I will drink it. I know you do not love me, for your sisters have, as I do remember, done me wrong. You have some cause, they have not. Cordelia, no cause, no cause." Cordelia's simple no cause might stand for the whole of Christian love. Her natural reticence suggests that when one loves, one does not let complications of feeling and imposed meanings overshadow the pure thing itself. She desires Lear's good, his salvation, and to worry about the causes, reasons, or intentions of his injuries would bring mercy into the mire. Nevertheless, this beautiful power of love and care that feels eschatological lasts only a moment. Shakespeare's tragedies could rightly be described, I think, in terms of the great mechanism of natural justice, a momentous absence of mercy, not in private moments like this one, but in the large unfolding of events set in motion by an unjust choice. Desdemona might forgive her husband with her dying breath, but nothing intervenes to divert the terrible momentum of Othello's jealousy and save her life. Similarly, time does not cooperate with Edmund's sincere attempt to do some good before he dies, and the desperate attempt to forestall the hanging of Cordelia comes too late. A scene or two after their reconciliation, Lear comes on stage bearing the body of his saintly daughter. Why do events take a happier turn in the comedies? Not because characters don't make terrible choices, but because other choices offset these potentially tragic ones, and mercy becomes efficacious. In The Merchant of Venice, for example, Portia's intervention in the trial between, you remember, Shylock and Antonio are in trial, and Shylock is demanding payment as in the pound of flesh closest to Antonio's heart. But Portia's intervention in this trial might be seen as a kind of this sort of offsetting choice. She urges mercy upon the vengeful Shylock. Asked why he must be merciful, she famously replies that the quality of mercy is not strained. Its very nature is that it cannot be forced, as she has not been forced to be present in her crucial role as mediator. In Measure for Measure, Isabella urges mercy upon Angelo, who has condemned Isabella's brother Claudio to death for breaking the Viennese law against fornication. Here's Isabella. No ceremony that to great ones longs, not the king's crown, nor the deputed sword, the marshal's truncheon, nor the judge's robe, become them with one half so good a grace as mercy does. Mercy becomes them because it is unforced. And this unforced quality also means that it cannot be expected. As Aeschylus says in the same play, mercy is not itself that oft looks so. Pardon is still the nurse of second woe. That is, if you let off people too easily all the time, there is certain to be an increase of the crime that you're pardoning. But again, is it possible to show this grace of office, this highest and best thing, mercy, unless you have a power of office or of moral ascendancy? It's a real question, I think, in the way that Shakespeare presents these things. In The Tempest, for example, Prospero has the occasion, through his masterful magic, to punish his brother Antonio, who usurped his dukedom, as well as the king of Naples, who helped him. If you remember the story, Prospero calls up the great storm because he knows that the ships of the king of Naples, including his brother as Duke of Milan, are passing by his island. And he has the power to bring them to the island and control the circumstances that they experience. Antonio, Prospero's brother, had intentions when he took Prospero's dukedom that were clearly murderous. He went so far as to set Prospero and Miranda to sea without provisions so that he could dispose of them without actually committing murder. Only the help of the good Gonzalo, who is one of the men around Antonio and Alonso, the king of Naples, only Gonzalo, who secretly provided them with water and food, and Providence divine, as Prospero says, allowed them to make it to the island where they now live. Through his art, Prospero regains his dukedom, severs the obligation of paying tribute to Naples, and establishes a stronger bond between Milan and Naples by marrying Miranda to Alonso's son, Ferdinand. But the only instance of outright forgiveness in the play might be Prospero's treatment of his brother Antonio. And this does not strike us to the heart, I suspect, like Cordelia's no cause. Here's what Prospero says to Antonio: "For you, most wicked sir, whom to call brother would even infect my mouth, I do forgive thy rankest fault, all of them, and require my dukedom of thee, which perforce I know thou must restore." Prospero might insist on full punishment, but instead he forgives, he exercises mercy, he pardons the offense. The strong implication here is that Prospero could not forgive his brother until he was able to destroy him if he so wished. Maybe I'm misreading that. That would be, again, worth discussion. But is this invidioso clementia, treacherous clemency, or does it have the savor of Christian love? That depends on Antonio's way of receiving grace. That is, whether he feels humiliated and belittled by it, or finds in it an opportunity to reform his life. Mercy, this extending mercy, leaves Prospero himself in the power of others and makes him vulnerable. As he says in the epilogue, "Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults." Shakespeare's problematic Measure for Measure may be the play in which forgiveness of an enemy is most powerfully embodied. And I'll close with a few remarks about Isabella, this character who both pleads for mercy and insists upon justice. Vienna under Duke Vincentio suffers from lawlessness and sexual corruption. There are brothels all over the city, taverns. There seems to be a general air of licentiousness that's come to be the dominant impression that anybody has of Vienna. And this isn't because Vienna lacks laws, but because the laws lack enforcement. I don't know whose fault this could be, except the Duke's own. He looks around and sees the circumstance into which his city has drifted under his apparent reluctance to exercise a more strict regime. He's like a number of other characters in Shakespeare. One of them, Henry VI, who is a scholarly man, unfit for power in the history plays. Prospero himself lost his dukedom because he was so caught up in his studies that he didn't take care of the practical matters surrounding him. And there's some suggestion in Measure for Measure that the Duke has a similar character. But he sees that he needs to do something to remedy things. So he decides to leave Vienna, or at least to pretend to do so, while he actually takes on the disguise of a friar. And he gives the government of the city to the harsh, but, a highly reputable Lord Angelo, whom everyone looks to as a sort of moral exemplar, though he strikes us, I think, as a kind of Puritan, and maybe would appear to Shakespeare's audience precisely in that role. Someone who's got a puritanical streak, even though he lives in this very Catholic and city full of friars and nuns and so on. Anyway, left in charge, Angelo immediately cracks down on sexual lawlessness. And the first victim is Isabella's brother, Claudio, whose guilt is made apparent by the pregnancy of his fiancée, Giulietta. They have enjoyed their connubial rights before they've actually completed the ceremonies of their marriage. They're legally bound together in terms of being engaged, but that subtlety doesn't matter to Angelo. Angelo sentences him to death, and the novice nun, Isabella, intervenes to plead for her brother's life, whereupon Angelo finds himself completely smitten with her. If this were another play, another place, perhaps he could conceivably woo her honorably, even though she's about to enter the convent. But he thinks of sexual desire pathologically. And when she visits the second time, he offers to spare Claudio only if Isabella will yield up her body to his will. She refuses, but the Duke, in disguise as a monk, this is a very complicated plot, convinces her to allow him to substitute Angelo's own rejected fiancée, Mariana, in her place, which accomplishes several ends at once. Mariana had been engaged to Angelo some years before, but when her dowry didn't come through because her brother was on a shipwreck, et cetera, Angelo decided to break off the engagement in a pretty callous way. But the worst thing Angelo does is that even after this sort of bed trick in which he thinks that he slept with Isabella, he still sends the order to kill Claudio because he worries that Claudio might find out that his life has been purchased by this means. Angelo actually slept with Mariana, but he thinks that he has slept with Isabella. At the end of the play, the Duke returns publicly as though he'd actually been absent. So there's a kind of godlikeness in this play. It feels a little bit like a parable, as G. Wilson Knight said about it. God seems absent, but he's actually most intimately present. So the Duke here returns publicly to exercise justice as though he'd been absent, whereas in fact, he's been gathering more than enough inner evidence to condemn Angelo to death, which he promptly does. The play could end with a satisfying, if not exactly comic, justice. But Mariana intervenes and calls upon Isabella to kneel with her to plead for Angelo's life. As the Duke says, it's against all sense for Isabella to kneel, since Angelo has killed her brother, at least as far as she knows, and made enough evil choices to wedge him in a spot far down in Dante's Inferno. He's an enemy to everything dear to her, including her own chastity. Nevertheless, she kneels with Mariana to plead for mercy. She loves him for Mariana's sake, and she can do so, I would argue, because she now has him in her power, or let's call it the power of her care. She asks for his pardon from the Duke, I would also argue, out of Christian love, not insisting upon revenge for his perfidy. The Duke's knowing intervention and his disguise as the friar has consistently kept Angelo's evil choices from taking effect, although Isabella still thinks that Angelo has killed her brother. At the end, the Duke not only reveals that Claudio is still alive, but he also pardons all the offenders by correcting their faults with the comic solution. Marriages all around, including Isabella's marriage to him. I'm not going to say anything here about love your enemies. Is marriage the solution because it's a way of reconciling natural enemies? No, of course But in this play, it's a little more problematic since Mariana has done, I mean, Angelo has done grave injustices to Mariana. And Lucio, one of the characters in the play, is forced to marry a prostitute whom he impregnated earlier. These aren't the happiest marriage scenes. And we're left a little uncertain at the end of the play about whether Isabella is actually going to accept the Duke's offer of marriage. But in these plays, it strikes me that Christian love of enemies necessarily involves a power of care, often glimpsed in Shakespeare's late plays. This high participation in God's power to send his goodness like sunlight and rain upon the just and the unjust without discrimination between them. Such a gift requires a transcendence of self that's as simple as love, as rare as Cordelia, and as bountiful as Shakespeare himself with these 36 plays of his that give us the whole range of human emotion. And I think help us to see in many ways the nature of what enmity is, what selfishness is, but also what opens up into these high and rare moments of Christian love. Thanks.
Glenn, thank you so much. It's fantastic. As is typical, my mind is going a mile a minute. You dropped a bunch of things that I want to sort of get in on here. But I guess I'll start off I'm struck, when you talk about enemies and Christian love, that surrounding and maybe even seeding, seeding, seeding sort of Shakespeare's work is this context of revenge. And I remember back in the day when you taught me Shakespeare, we actually spent some time reading kids the Spanish tragedy, which is that am I getting that right?
Yeah.
And I remember you talking quite a bit, and there's so many of these plays out of which Shakespeare springs, like the milieu of his life's work, seem to be really focused on this idea of revenge. And revenge, is such a real and visceral thing, and yet it seems to be this sort of this almost this kind of this black hole that Shakespeare knows he has to contend with in both his tragedies and then, of course, into his comedies. And I'm wondering, have you sort of had any sort of deeper meditations on this sort of this black hole of revenge that he comes out of?
Yeah. I mean, I think the impulse for revenge, as I was suggesting at the beginning, is very natural to us.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that's the very thing you see being worked out in the Aristeia, Aeschylus Aristeia.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking that. That's right.
Yeah. So, the ancients are just as aware of the need to get past this cycle of revenge as Christians are, though they don't have the same basis, obviously, for getting past it. But yeah, it is a sort of black hole. It's an attempt to try to take out on someone else the whole of what you've been deprived of.
Yeah.
And it's that sense of an almost infinite deprivation,
right,
that makes it so destructive.
Well, there's no stopping mechanism to it, right? I mean,
Right.
when you talk about feuds and blood feuds, and I'm thinking, of course, of the Hatfield and McCoys and our own sort of literary landscape in this country. But I don't know about you, but I've always the Oresteia has always sort of played a prominent role in my imagination since I studied it back in the day. But there is something sort of strangely artificial and unsatisfying about Athena popping up at the end, right? And just sort of saying, well, okay, down everybody. Let's
Right.
just,
Right.
she sort of just by the force of her own power, right? Interesting. It's just power. It's really nothing more than that, that she basically tells everybody, well, you just need to be satisfied and you need to be satisfied. And that's kind of it.
Yeah. I think the point there is, that Athena is trying to deflect
Yeah.
this, justice into some kind of judicial system or jury, um, where these matters don't have to be handled, with individually
Yeah.
as a matter of revenge. But thinking back to your previous question about the black hole of revenge, I've been teaching Paradise Lost a good
Yeah.
bit in the last 2 or 3 years,
Yeah.
and I think about Satan,
Yeah.
and his infinite deprivation once he actually rebels against God. Um, he's given up forever, his own beatitude,
Yeah.
and so the revenge for giving up that good, which is his own fault,
Yeah.
is endless. How do you ever recompense that? Sort of like that asymptotic line that I remember vaguely from mathematics. It gets closer and closer, but
It just
never
never gets there.
never
Yeah.
gets there. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I've been teaching Paradise Lost the last few years myself, and my mind definitely went there, but also with Prospero, and I wonder, um, it's such a strange play, as everybody before me has commented on. So this is nothing novel. It's such a strange play because I contend, in what I've been seeing the last few years of teaching it, is that it's a revenge play, that takes a sudden sort of left turn at Albuquerque, and something precipitates this change. I wonder if you've thought about the oddity of Prospero's change, um, the sea change, right? As Ariel's song would have it. To what do you attribute that sea change in Prospero? Because that's what he's orchestrating, right? I mean, he's orchestrating a revenge.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I'm playing with in his, forgiveness of Antonio. What is it that moves him? I mean, there's a moment in the play you could say is where it happens. When Ariel describes the poor state of things that
Yep.
all of Prospero's victims are suffering, and says, it's probably enough, and I'd be moved if I saw that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and mine would, sir, would I human,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so Prospero at that point makes a turn. I'm not sure that revenge is actually his motive, at least not revenge in the way that, say, Hamlet's motive is revenge.
Yeah.
Um, but but somehow a setting right of things, and clearly by getting all these men into his power.
Hmm.
That's the necessary thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
If he can't be in a situation where he can forgive them and truly exercise nobility
Hmm.
toward them, then I don't think we get the comic ending of the play.
So his moral authority. You mentioned the first third of your talk. And by the way, audience members, please submit questions to the Q&A so that you can get your questions in here to Dr. Arbery. But you talk about power as necessary to give pardon. You said, well, what about moral superiority? And Prospero does indeed have a moral superiority insofar as he's been deeply wronged, right?
Right.
But he can't offer mercy that what does he say, the rare action, as he calls it, right? He can't offer that until he has everybody literally circumscribed in this sort of circle on the beach of his island. And so he's got everybody, in there enthralled, by his and Ariel's power, right? They're all right there. But it's only then that he can sort of offer any kind of efficacious forgiveness, right?
Yeah. So yeah, and so the question is, how do we puzzle that out?
Yeah, yeah,
It's almost as though in order to be capable of forgiveness, you have to turn the tables on your enemy and get them in your power.
hmm
Um, so moral superiority, what exactly do we mean by that?
yeah, yeah.
I think these days, moral superiority means, some claim of victimhood.
That's right. Yeah, that's where I'm getting at. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So, is that in itself, um, a kind of um, superiority, or is that in fact uh, another form of revenge? If
hmm
if in that position of moral superiority, you don't exercise forgiveness, but instead you say, "No, this still not enough,
That's right.
still not
That's
enough."
right. Move the goalpost.
We have another abyss, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
sort of like the abyss of revenge.
That's right.
Um,
That's
you're
right.
you're attempting to try to make up for some loss that can't ever fully be made up for,
Yeah.
unless the true moral superiority of of forgiveness or mercy exerts itself there. So it's not the victimhood per se that gives you moral superiority, but that capacity you know to be in the position to exercise mercy.
To accept it. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I've got questions here. I do. So I sense that there's something in the scandal of the figure of Jesus that I think is operative here, and maybe we can get into that. That the scandal is not that he heals the paralytic man; it's the scandal that he's forgiven him of his sins.
Yeah.
And of course, this is some dusty rabbi in the desert who sort of audaciously says, well, your sins are forgiven. Oh, you want to get up too? Okay, we'll get up. But anyway, let's get to. So I have an audience question here. What role does liberal education, including reading Shakespeare, play in easing social relations and helping us to love not only our neighbors but our enemies? That's a good question.
I think it. This, I think, particularly works through literature.
hmm
It helps you to imagine from within, as Shakespeare does all the time. The voice and the argument of someone else whose opinions might be absolutely different from your own. Simply to occupy that imaginative space, I think, gives you a better ground of discussion, instead of always having your own opinion ratified by others, and demonizing anyone who disagrees. It gives you a chance to think into the understanding of others, and get a wider perspective on your own position and why it means so much. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's true what you think. But how do you get across that truth to someone else? That's a difficulty. It's not going to be overcome by demonizing them, but probably by understanding them.
Hmm. Yeah,
But
it's yeah.
yeah, I mean, liberal education obviously is a lot more than uh, literature, but
hmm
I think it's literature that in many ways helps us the most in that regard.
Yeah, and maybe that's perhaps one of the reasons why it's held with some degree of suspicion, right? That it's the sort of those that would prefer sort of clear and robust lines and clear and robust boundaries, and therefore clear and robust visions of the good and the bad, are most suspicious of this discipline that forces me to uh, maybe love my neighbor, but to inhabit my neighbor and to inhabit my enemy and to give him, his due. And maybe that's one of the strange experiences. You brought up Milton's Paradise Lost. I mean, I don't know about you, but it continues to be this sort of uh, uh, both eerie and energizing experience to give voice to Satan's lament
Yeah.
It's a remarkable experience that I can see uh, mess with my students.
Yeah.
Because at some point you have to say, well, God, this is Satan.
Yeah.
I kind of like what he's saying right now.
Yeah. Yeah. This sounds so noble.
Yeah,
Sounds so resolute, when Satan wakes up in hell and, he still has this uh, resolve to get revenge and not to be defeated, never to admit, that he's been crushed. So yeah, there's something in that spiritedness, I think, that appeals to um, something in the heart,
yeah,
and you can see where the um, sophistry
yeah,
sophistry of Satan would be most effective.
yeah.
Um, yeah, what did you say before that? You were talking about before you mentioned Satan. You were, I don't know. There's a point you were making that I was going to take up, and I've forgotten what it was. Sorry.
Well, I think I'm showing
You
my
have
age too because I have forgotten.
to.
I
Okay.
had forgotten what I said. Anyway, but fortunately, we've got a second question that will save us here. We'll see. Okay, so this is the second question. It seems this is it. It seems that even a natural level showing mercy, even at a natural level, showing mercy is advantageous for individuals, at least on a psychological level. There is a certain natural freedom in not being bound by vengeance or revenge. On a Christian level, is it fair to say that Christian mercy usurps any thought about oneself and is captured by love of the other, even if they might be the enemy, as shown perhaps in the lives of the saints in Calvary?
Well, that's a beautiful question,
Mm, mm.
um, and I think the argument in it is I mean, it's sort of its own answer. It's I don't know if I would use the word usurp. That's interesting, though.
I know that I jumped on
Could
that
you
one too.
repeat that line?
Yeah, sure. On Christian level, is it fair to say that Christian mercy usurps any thought about oneself?
Yeah. Um, Christian mercy has to put aside the self in some profound way, I think. In other words, especially if it involves a matter um, of justice that we feel in our own hearts, in the same way we were just talking about, by listening to those arguments of Satan. There's a kind of snag or a hook in the heart that that someone's insult or injury to
Yeah.
us
In,
leaves
in,
there.
injured
And
merit. Yeah.
yeah, and so if you're truly going to exercise mercy, you have to give that up. You have to excise that. You can't be thinking about yourself at the same time you're exercising mercy in this way. So you can't be thinking about your psychological benefit either,
Yeah.
right? I
Right.
mean,
Because as soon as you start playing that game, then
yeah,
you're not really engaged in that rare action.
that's right.
You're being calculating, which is its own kind of, again, that's another thing that's haunting the Shakespeare's world of Machiavels and
Right.
gulls and all of that.
Yeah. Is mercy simply a kind of, I mean, it can be, you could think, a sort of easy way out of a complex situation. Oh, I don't want to deal with that, so I'm
Right.
not gonna mess with it. I'm
Well,
not
and
gonna
then and
pursue it.
that can manifest itself, of course, in poor leadership, right? I
Right.
mean, we've seen that
Exactly.
where a poor leader will not wanting to get messy, will just say, "Okay, fine, it's fine. You don't have to worry
Right.
about it."
Yeah.
You're like, "Well,
Don't
that
worry
actually
about that.
matters."
Yeah, it does matter. You have to deal with it in some way, and so mercy, true mercy, is different from that kind of avoidance of difficult decisions, which seems to be the case actually with the Duke and Measure for Measure. I
Yeah.
suspect that play is one of Shakespeare's less read, but it's pretty important the way I think we see mercy working out in it.
Yeah, and I'm struck. Uh, I'm struck by the calls for mercy. You know, anyway, I'm struck by I'm going back to Prospero and his brother Antonio. Antonio is not sad at the end of that play. I
No,
mean, he is
no,
not at all contrite.
you don't feel any repentance on his part,
Yeah.
right? He still has that kind of sarcastic air
Yeah.
to him,
Yeah,
that
he's not a serious man.
no. I
He's
mean,
not a serious man.
he and Sebastian, keep up their sort of cynical commentary on
Yeah.
things all the way to the end.
Yeah.
So yeah, how is he going to receive this mercy that Prospero has just extended to him?
And you have to wonder, my mind does this game where I start to think, okay, so Prospero's going to, he's going to go back. He's going to go to Naples to witness the nuptials, right? The official nuptials, and I assume the coronations and whatnot. And then he's going to go back to Milan, and every third thought will be of his own death. And I'm sure, okay, fine. So now you're back in Milan, and you're now the Duke again. Not for nothing, but it's been, you just got hosed for 12 years. I mean, people are implicated in this thing. It's not just his brother, how is this all going to work? Right. Because, fine, you would imagine that he certainly has the interpersonal ability to extend forgiveness to his brother, but they're the sort of the concerns of the city, that they're the concerns of the populace or the polis, and so I'm not sure how that would play itself out. I mean, how do we forgive each other in the political?
Yeah, I think that's the toughest sphere of
Yeah.
forgiveness, isn't it?
Yeah.
The great example in modern times is I think been in South Africa.
Yeah.
After
Yeah.
after apartheid ended,
Yeah.
that was certainly the great attempt. Um, I'm not sure what the long term effects of that have been.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Well,
Uh,
in political circles, um, even more so, people die after about 75 years. you know but
yeah,
in political memory is a whole different thing.
yeah,
I was talking with my friend Rod, and he's in Budapest for the summer, and he's talking about, like, people there are still ticked off about the Treaty of Trianon. And most Americans don't even know what this treaty is, but this is something that occurred at the end of World War I, in which big portions of their country were parceled off by the authorities of the Allied forces, right? And like, they're still mad about that, like really mad, and in some ways really justified in their anger. So how do you say, yeah, my bad, so sorry? Like, how do you work that stuff out? I mean, I think it's a real question. And
yeah,
certainly, look, in our own country, this is precisely what all this talk about reconciliation or reckoning. And I'm really nervous about that word reckoning. But how are we sort of trying to sort all this sort of stuff out right now?
right. I mean, it's very difficult. I think the whole question of reparations for slavery, it's
Yep.
probably what you had on your mind.
That's right.
What do you do about that, right? Are we the inheritors of, the system of slavery, uh, morally obligated to, somehow set right what our ancestors did,
Yeah.
institutionally? I mean, those are big questions that are not going to go away anytime soon.
Right.
So yeah, political forgiveness has to do with these corporate bodies of memory that are
Right.
are very different from individual ones.
So this dovetails into one of the questions I have here in the Q&A. See what we can do with this one, Glenn. To what degree does Shakespeare claim that loving one's enemies depends on a Christian anthropology? Thinking about our own social context, is it possible to love our enemies in a post-Christian society? It's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good
It's a good
question.
one. It's a good one.
Um,
In other words, is there such a thing as genuine uh, loving of enemy outside of specifically Christian anthropology?
I mean, there has to be some version of it. I mean, there's some natural version of it, I think, um, in the pre-Christian world, and so there must be some version of it in the post-Christian world.
Yeah.
But post-Christian world is everywhere informed by Christianity. Regardless of what you say, right?
Right, but
Oh,
regardless of your confessional status,
right.
right? As Tom
It's
Holland is pointing out in Dominion, it's impossible really for any of us to be fully post-Christian because we can't get rid of our own DNA.
exactly. That's, I mean, it's part of the way we understand ourselves morally. Um, and criticisms of Christianity are most likely, from so-called post-Christians, going to be because of some failure of particular Christians to live up to what Christianity
That's
actually
right.
presents. So, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, we get into questions of grace here, uh, questions of whether you actually are in the presence of God in your own life and so on. And those are very delicate and personal.
Yeah, so getting into this, I have another question here that I think takes up this idea of the interplay between the corporate, the corporate body and the individual. The question is, can the law embody love of enemies, or is it limited to the private virtue of the statesman? And I'll add, is it limited to the private virtue of the citizen?
Yeah. I don't I don't see how you put love of enemies into the law, um, in this sense that um, quality of mercy is not strained. You can't enforce love. It can't be something that is required
Right,
legally.
right.
I mean, law has to do with questions of justice, or it should.
Yeah.
Whereas this kind of love of enemy, uh, I think by its nature, transcends what the law can insist upon.
Well, just to problematize that a little bit, I mean, I always think of like the wedding vows, right? And the priest doesn't ask us, do you love this woman, right? It says, will you love this woman, right? So it's love, not so much as affect as love as a function of the will. And I wonder if that is operative in this conversation.
Well, it might be, right. I mean, you don't, in other words, you don't want to use the law to um, crush people.
Yeah,
You
that's
don't
right.
institutionalize hatred of your enemy. But yeah, there is a sort of insistence on loving your enemy in the sense of giving your enemy justice.
Yeah.
Would be, I think, part of what the law should be.
That's right. That's right. Okay, I do have a last question here, and I think it does attempt to sort of draw us here to a close. So thank you for whoever submitted this one. Commenting on the role of the divine in mercy, does not the appearance of Athena in the Oresteia imply that God must enter into the picture in order to execute peace through mercy? Isn't the impulse for vengeance so strong that only the divine can heal it or stifle it? At the same time, isn't it the abandonment to the divine will that gives one the power needed to exercise mercy?
Yeah, yes to all the above. I
Yeah,
think mercy is ultimately divine.
yeah,
It's a break with that, what I call the mechanism of natural justice.
hmm,
It lifts us out of that, and I think that's what you see. Um, you know, Sort of adumbrated in the appearance of
mm,
Athena at the end of the
mm.
Oresteia, or her appearance at the end of the Odyssey,
Right. I was
where
just going to
she
say that. Yeah,
yeah,
it's the exact same ending. Yeah, yeah.
right, exact same ending where she comes in and says that's enough, but it has to be in effect divinely mandated peace, that brings that um, comes through the workings of the human order. It comes into it and changes it.
And I think that is perhaps what that prior question about is Christian anthropology. The requirement that we love our not only our neighbors but our enemies as we love ourselves. I mean, that really is the thing that's missing from the current discourse, isn't it?
Yeah,
As you said, justice, justice, justice.
yeah,
The only answer to that is love, love, love,
right, right,
because justice, justice, justice is unending and unstoppable and ultimately bloody.
yeah. And
So,
yeah, it's the unfillable abyss.
That's right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour and therefore the end of our first session. I want to, in particular, thank Wyoming Catholic College for sponsoring today's this session, but really all three sessions today. I want to personally thank Glenn for coming and giving us a wonderful presentation. As always, Glenn, you give us so much to sort of chew on and to think through, and it's always a pleasure to be in the presence of someone who makes you feel Shakespeare. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Kale.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye bye.